Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. An overview. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia in 1957 into a billionaire family. Bin Laden was inspired by the ideology of Qutb, an Egyptian Islamist theorist who criticized Arab leaders as oppressive and too influenced by the materialism and secularism of the West. Bin Laden proclaimed the restoration of traditional moral values and to ultimately establish a caliphate, a state free of influence from the West and where all Muslims, Sunnis and Shias alike, could unite and better their lives under the religious laws of the Quran. In the early 1980s, Osama joined the fight in Afghanistan in order to help free the country from its Soviet occupation. He was active in raising money and recruiting fighters from across the region and was influential in establishing an Arab army that operated parallel with the Afghani resistance. The fighting increasingly radicalized the Arab volunteers, and their viewpoints were not necessarily shared by the local population. It is claimed that it was in Afghanistan in 1988 that the idea for Al-Qaeda was first formed. After the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia. He felt victorious that his Arab army had played a part in ousting a foreign power from a fellow Muslim country. So when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, he was confident that this conflict should and could be solved without Western interference. When the West did become involved, he criticized his government for allowing American troops to be stationed in Saudi Arabia. His further outspoken criticism over the presence of an international coalition resulted in expulsion, and in 1992 he exiled himself to Sudan. Due to terrorist activity, the United States pressurized the Sudanese government to oust him. Bin Laden was unable to return to his homeland, as Saudi Arabia had stripped him of his citizenship in 1994. So, in 1996, when bin Laden was forced to leave Sudan, he returned to Afghanistan. It was around this time that Al-Qaeda changed character and became a more established group. Until now, bin Laden had fought his cause within the region, but as he had failed to gain local recognition, he turned the focus outwards towards the United States, claiming justification over its interference in Middle Eastern politics. In 1998, bin Laden formally announced Al-Qaeda's new strategy, emphasizing anti-United States rhetoric and encouraging attacks upon the West. The 9/11 attack. At the time of the attack on the World Trade Center, Osama bin Laden was not a central person in Afghanistan, the Middle East, or North Africa. He was banned from his country of birth and had fled afar to the northwestern corner of Afghanistan. 9/11 further weakened bin Laden and Al-Qaeda's position. All Muslim political leaders condemned his action, apart from Saddam Hussein, although he was careful to offer sympathy to the victims. Religious leaders also condemned the attack. Bin Laden's ideological dream of unifying the Muslim community into a caliphate seemed further away than ever. The aftermath of 9/11. Although Al-Qaeda had been left isolated by the regimes and the major non-state actors in the Middle East and North Africa, the attack on the World Trade Center had an impact on the growth of Al-Qaeda. The group instantly became the focus of worldwide political concern and mass media attention. A range of radical individuals and isolated political groups proclaimed affiliation with Al-Qaeda in order to gain reputation. This happened despite the fact that bin Laden only claimed responsibility for the 9/11 attack as late as 2004. In 2001 and 2003, when the war on terror was launched in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Islamist extremist movement was further consolidated. The presence of an outside aggressor provided a common enemy people could team up against. It increased the appeal for individuals to join radical organizations, and it also provided a unifier for extremist groups. It made it easier to ignore their differences. It has become evident that a number of terrorist groups from across the region adopted the name Al-Qaeda. The Algerian militant group GSPC became Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. Various movements in Saudi Arabia and Yemen merged into Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, and Al-Shabaab became Al-Qaeda in Somalia. Al-Qaeda became a franchise of scattered member groups. The members benefited from their link to Al-Qaeda by getting increased public attention, recruits, training, and funding. In return, the alliance made Al-Qaeda appear more powerful. When the franchises carried out violent attacks, they now attributed them to Al-Qaeda, and they would be reported as such in the media, despite still being motivated by domestic goals. Here are a few examples. A defector from Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb organized the Amena hostage crisis in Algeria in 2013. The motive was pressurizing France to cease military action in northern Mali. Al-Shabaab carried out the 2013 Westgate shopping mall and the 2015 Garissa University attacks in Kenya. Both were in retaliation for Kenya's military presence in Somalia. Al-Qaeda gave the impression of being a homogenized, well-organized threat, whereas in reality the Al-Qaeda network was marked by disagreements both between the parent organization and its members, as well as within the franchises themselves. Impact of the War on Terror. The Western military invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the so-called War on Terror, helped bin Laden's anti-Western ideology to penetrate the mainstream population. The Western powers did not have a plan in place for rebuilding the countries following the devastating attacks. As a result, Afghanistan and Iraq, and later on Libya, were left in a power vacuum that destabilized the countries. Security forces, institutions, and infrastructures collapsed, and living standards deteriorated. Bin Laden's anti-Western sentiment gained appeal amongst the many unemployed and dispossessed who had suffered as a result of the wars. It became easy to find recruits for terrorist activities. In the time following the invasions, the two countries spiraled into violence. Suicide bombings became commonplace, and Iraq experienced an upsurge in sectarian friction. The Sunni minority had been protected under the former secular leader Saddam Hussein, but the new Shia leadership suppressed the Sunnis, and tension rose. This is illustrated by the fact that before 2003 no suicide attacks occurred, but by 2010 around 1,000 suicide bombings had reportedly taken place in Iraq. It was those circumstances that allowed the most notable Al-Qaeda franchise, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, later to become Islamic State, to gain a foothold. Soon after the fall of Saddam Hussein, the Sunni leader al-Zarqawi launched suicide attacks and bombings on a large scale inside the country. He took advantage of the flow of people who came to help resist the US-led coalition, and his army grew. Bin Laden supported al-Zarqawi, and despite disagreement between the two, al-Zarqawi decided that it was strategically wise to change the group's name to Al-Qaeda in Iraq, or AQI, in 2004. Bin Laden criticized AQI for attacking Iraq's Shia population. He reminded al-Zarqawi that their common enemy was the West, and to embrace both Shias and Sunnis according to his view of a caliphate that included all Muslims. In 2006, the conflict between bin Laden and al-Zarqawi escalated, and the latter changed his group's name to Islamic State in Iraq, or ISI. However, for the time being, it still remained under Al-Qaeda's umbrella. Al-Zarqawi was assassinated in an attack by US fighter jets in 2006. In 2011, when the US withdrew from Iraq, the sectarian friction escalated. Shia Prime Minister al-Maliki excluded Sunnis from power, and they were increasingly exposed to attacks. Many from Saddam Hussein's old army could not find employment, and they turned to ISI. The conflict deepened, and with a lack of resolution, attitudes hardened and paved the way for Islamic State to grow into a dominant militant force. The new leader, al-Baghdadi, was committed to fight the Sunnis' cause and to establish a purist Sunni Islamic State by whatever means, taking territory first in Iraq, then in Syria. Syria and the rise of Islamic State. In 2011, during the civil unrest in Syria, al-Baghdadi dispatched one of his commanders, Syrian-born al-Julani, to fight Assad's forces. The same year, bin Laden was killed whilst exiled in Pakistan, and al-Zawahiri took over the leadership of Al-Qaeda. Meanwhile, al-Julani gained support amongst the Syrian rebel forces, and in 2012 he formed the anti-government group al-Nusra. In 2013, al-Baghdadi announced that ISI was merging with al-Nusra, appointing himself as leader. He renamed the group as ISIL, Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which is also known as ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Al-Julani and al-Qaeda's new leader, al-Zawahiri, showed concern about the establishment of ISIL, and al-Baghdadi was ordered back to Iraq. But instead, ISIL continued its violence in Syria. In 2014, al-Qaeda urged ISIL to stop attacking other Muslim groups. In February 2014, al-Qaeda renounced ISIL. Since then, al-Qaeda, the al-Nusra Front, and other rebel groups have generally fought ISIL, although the lines are blurred, as there is also evidence of cooperation between al-Nusra and ISIL in some localities. Whereas ISIL consists of mainly foreign fighters, as was the case with the Arab resistance fighters in Afghanistan in the 1980s, the al-Qaeda-backed al-Nusra Front comprises mainly Syrians. After the break with al-Qaeda, ISIL declared itself a caliphate with al-Baghdadi as its caliph. ISIL's rise to power appears to have superseded al-Qaeda as the world's biggest Islamist extremist organization. Islamist groups increasingly claim to be linked to ISIL instead of al-Qaeda. The Nigerian-based Boko Haram, for instance, changed its allegiance from al-Qaeda to ISIL in March 2015. Several Libyan resistance groups have also pledged loyalty to Islamic State. Individual attackers, commonly known as lone wolves, have likewise begun to claim ideological sympathy with ISIL. Whereas the January 2015 attack on Charlie Hebdo was attributed to a branch of al-Qaeda in Yemen, the French and Belgian citizens who carried out the Bataclan atrocities in Paris later in the year claimed allegiance to ISIL. ISIL has become the focus of attention for politicians and the media, as was the case for al-Qaeda at the time after 9/11. The group appears to have established itself as the new major global terror organization, and the international community is now faced with the challenge on how to deal with it.